The Ayn Rand Institute has been, since the beginning, a principal defender of freedom of speech. And one of our latest efforts to help the public understand the importance and nature of freedom of speech is a publication of a new book titled The First Amendment: Essays on the Importance of Intellectual Freedom by Tara Smith. And this book also has contributions by Onkar Gate, Elan Giorno, and Gregory Salmieri. I'm Agustina Vergara Cid. This is a podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute, and with me is Dr. Gregory Salmieri, senior scholar of philosophy in the Salem Center for Policy at the University of Texas at Austin. And he has an essay in this new First Amendment book titled Free Speech as a Right and a Way of Life. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. I really found this essay really valuable when I read it. But let me ask you, so, in this essay, you have addressed the fundamental aspects of freedom of speech. Part of it is what this right actually is, what it entails, and how people today get it wrong, and other aspects of it. So, can you tell us about why you consider this topic so important to write about, and more broadly, what the value of freedom of speech is in our society?
Well, I think there's just a lot of confusion about what free speech is in general, including among people who defend it. I mean, think about how you started out by saying the Ayn Rand Institute has, since the beginning, been a defender of freedom of speech, a principled defender. But ARI has done a lot of things that people would have thought of as anti-free speech. After all, it doesn't have people on its platforms that it disagrees with too much. It's been very thoughtful about its associations with other people and groups, and a lot of people have put it down as intolerant. And a free speech group would have people talking about all different topics there from all different points of view. But ARI has been very meticulous about maintaining certain standards about who could say what on its channels and about in what context its speakers will interact with other people. So ARI has been a principled defender and exponent of free speech only on a certain understanding of free speech, the right understanding. But that's not the understanding that you get in a lot of quarters these days. And so it's just a term that's contested. And I think the first thing to think about it is that it's a right. And a right means it's an aspect of the liberty that we have as human beings to lead our own lives for our own sakes by our own judgment, and to therefore be free of one another, interacting with one another voluntarily, but not forcing ourselves on other people when they don't want to deal with us. And free speech is a kind of component of that right. It's the idea that when you speak, you're not merely by speaking, merely by communicating ideas, forcing yourself on anybody. And moreover, the distinction between speaking, between communicating ideas and forcing yourself on other people is a crucial distinction to understand even what it means to force yourself on someone, because the alternative to dealing with somebody by force is to dealing with people by consent and persuasion. And there's no such thing as consent and persuasion if you can't communicate with people, make them an offer, see if they accept it, make an overture to somebody, and will they agree? So we have to think, even though when I make a noise, it's impacting on your eardrums, in some sense, there's physical things going on between us. We have to understand, when are those communication, and when are they my intruding into your life? And the concept of free speech is as a right, which is what I think the concept is, and it only should be used for the right to free speech, is to recognize that within the sphere of actions that I could take without intruding upon you or anybody else, is putting ideas out into the world, communicating such that you could hear me, um, and that's just part of, again, what it is for me to live my life, not to harass you, not to come and, put messages through your mailbox at all hours of the day and ring your door, then I am intruding on you. But if I can't say certain things, I can't let other people can't be allowed to hear me, then I have no way to interact with other people other than by force. And so you have to have that distinction of, are you free to express yourself? Are you free to share ideas, to try to get them out to an audience that's interested in hearing them, using your own resources without imposing on anybody else? Or are you not? And it's that right which is freedom of speech.
And today there are a lot of people who see themselves as kind of like champions of free speech, or that they're really big advocates of freedom of speech. And in this essay, you remark that this quote culture of free speech that some people advocate for, in doing like what you call the Millian perspective from John Stuart Mill, is actually not just wrong, but actually actively destructive. And there are
Yeah,
intellectuals like, yes, go ahead.
I think that's true. I mean, many of the intellectuals who think of themselves as millions and use million rhetoric sometimes, the people at Fire and elsewhere, have a lot to recommend them. And I think they do recognize the importance of being able to explore and communicate ideas. And on many particular issues, I think they're right. But the frame that they have for all of these things, how they conceptualize them, I think is often confused and mistaken, and it leads to some wrong ideas. Um, Essential to, I mean, what I think is stands out about the how should I put this? So, what would be paradigmatic of the kind of million idea is that there's something wrong with social sanction or social opprobrium for speech you don't like. If you're boycotting people, if you're firing people, if you're getting a group up to try to cancel people for saying something, there's something wrong and anti-free speech about that. Now, many cases of somebody firing something or someone or you know, putting someone down or trying to create a mob to quote cancel them over something they said. Many of those cases are unjust. Not all of them. It depends on what the person said and what they did. But many cases of refusing to deal with somebody based on their viewpoints can be unjust, but some of them are just. And whether they're just or unjust is not the same thing as whether they're a violation of anybody's rights, whether they're a violation of freedom of speech. People say things all the time that are unjust, wrong, downright evil, and yet are within their rights to free speech. If somebody spouts out some Nazi racist diatribe or whatever, it's disgusting and despicable, but it's part of his right to free speech to do it. And if I punch him in the face or try to arrest him or shoot him dead for saying those things, I'm violating his right to free speech. But if I shun him, don't want to deal with him, fire him, refuse to shop at his store, that's not violating his right to free speech. And indeed, it's expressing my own right to free speech because it's saying that I don't want to be a collaborator, a supporter in this speech of his. And if I continue to deal with him, certainly if I platform him for giving this speech, if I let him do it on my social media platform, if I publish his book in which he's saying it, but also if I continue to deal with him and give him money and give him the sanction of my association, in some way I'm contributing to, complicit with, cooperating in this act of speech. And it's part of my freedom of speech to decide what speech, what ideas, what kinds of communication do and don't have my sanction. So um, acts of firing, quote, cancellation, deplatforming are, when we mean by deplatforming, isn't violent deplatforming, isn't like, taking over a lecture hall and making sure somebody can't speak at it, but I own the platform and I'm deciding you can or can't use it. Those are expressions of, instances of the right to free speech, whether they're just or not. Some of them might be mistaken, and it might be that some of us should use our free speech to say that it was an overreaction or inappropriate or whatever for so and so to fire somebody over something he said. Uh, but that injustice is, I think, a very different kind of thing from the right to free speech, a violation of the right to free speech. And if we confuse them, if we conflate them, I think we do away with the right to free speech entirely.
Part of what I see is that people do understand that one in one's personal life should be able to associate with whoever one wants, right? And sometimes
Mhm.
people judge others because they spend time or are friends with or associate with people that they consider objectionable. But when it comes to freedom of speech, I've seen people who argue that it's different because there is a certain responsibility that some people and platforms have to provide to the public kind of like this wide array of views of different topics, so the people, the consumers, can judge and make decisions with
Mhm.
all the available informations and judge all the views out there. And the argument goes, if all views aren't platform, if there are some that this platform decides not to give prominence to, how are people to know that they exist and it says like, wouldn't that be detrimental to people? And it could be really good ideas that are being deplatformed, and so the public doesn't have access to those ideas. What would you say to that?
Well, the way it's put is an example of a kind of the world owes me a living kind of mentality. So there are lots of different foods in the world, and different people like different ones, and different ones are healthy for different people, and so forth. And so if you operate a restaurant, you're responsible for serving every kind of food to cater to every kind of palate. And if you don't serve, vegan Caribbean French fusion cuisine at your restaurant, well, then you're disadvantaging vegans who like Caribbean French fusion cuisine. And if it turns out that that kind of food is the wave of the future and everybody would be better off if it got popular or something like that, you're contributing to an environment in which that doesn't happen. And therefore, you, if you operate any kind of restaurant, owe the world and owe everybody who might want it that everything be on your menu. That's ridiculous. And it's the same thing with speech. If you're a platform, if you're a publisher, if you're a social media outlet, if you're a lecture hall, it's part of your business model to make decisions about what kind of things you deal with, what kind of speech you have there, what kind of communications are on your platform. And of course, different choices you make will make your platform more or less valuable to different customers, given their values. And if some of their values are right, there's going to be an objective answer to what would be a better platform. But that's true about a restaurant too. Maybe vegan fusion, whatever cuisine I said before, is really, really good, and all the restaurateurs are making a big mistake by not having it. Okay, in a free society, the people who think that have the right to vote with their feet and their dollars, and we'll see which ideas win out. And over the long run, the better ideas generally do win out. It's the same thing with speech and platforms. So if somebody is complaining that a platform, Twitter or Patreon or whatever it is, Substack, Google, YouTube, doesn't function the way they want to. It doesn't permit certain speech, or it doesn't promote certain speech that they want, or it doesn't function in a certain way. What thing are they doing? One thing they might be saying is, this is a downside to this platform for me. It's a reason I don't like it. It's a reason I want to use a different platform. I'm going to start a different platform or move my business to a different platform, or I'm not going to now, but I just want it to be known that I would love a platform that had these features that YouTube doesn't. And if someone else makes one, I'll go to it. When you're doing that, I think you're functioning as a responsible adult exercising his freedom. But if what you're doing is whining that YouTube or Substack or Facebook or X or whatever owes you a kind of service that's different from the one it wants to give, a service where it publishes and facilitates communications on different terms, you're not saying, I'd prefer that service, sign me up for that service, I don't like this about your service, I want to go to a different one. But you're saying, you owe it to us, you ought to, we have a right, you're a common carrier, damn it, and you have to serve us on the terms we want. It's the attitude of somebody who expects to be a ward of the state or the ward of society, and who regards all the other individuals, and especially all the businesses in society, as common carriers, as public utilities that have to be run for the benefit of everybody by the judgment of some commissar who this person imagines he can elect.
So is that part of, because in your essay you mentioned that this so-called culture of free speech is often a collectivistic perspective that is actually contrary to the First Amendment. Is this kind of like sacrificing these platforms to the altar of kind of like what is considered the public good or what's best for society? Is that part of that perspective?
Yes, absolutely. But I do think the idea of a culture of free speech is a good one. That is, there are cultural values that are the values of free speech. There is a culture that recognizes and implements the right to free speech and the values that give rise to that right. So I think there should be such a thing as a culture of free speech. But too often, what the people advocating for one are calling for is not a culture of um, people owning their responsibility to say what they want to say, to make decisions about what kind of speech they want to be associated with, and to respect other people's ability to do likewise. And then, in that kind of a context of free individuals, to work out who to deal with and why, and how to get their needs for communication met. That's what a real culture of free speech is. What too often passes for a culture of free speech among advocates is a culture of demanding that everybody be uncritical, that everybody be uncritical about what kind of speech they're willing to sanction on their own property, to endorse with their own sanction, to be willing to deal with. And that is not a culture of free speech at all, in my view. It's an anti-freedom culture, and an anti-free speech in particular culture. In the essay, I give some examples of this. I talk a lot about Ida Wells and her newspaper, The Free Speech, which her free speech and that of her co-publisher were horribly violated when a gang ransacked her offices and burned down the press and broke the type and threatened the lives of the publishers. Right. So this is, I think, as clear a violation of someone's free speech as you can get, and freedom of the press too. It's literally a press. But Wells wouldn't publish just anything in her paper. There were all kinds of instances in her autobiography of people who wanted her to publish certain appeals, and she didn't agree with them. And there were people that she broke with, certain people who had been formerly associated with the newspaper because they wanted to publish some kind of stories that she didn't want published in the paper. And this is the kind of thing that somebody who's responsible valuer of freedom of speech thinks about. They think about speaking as something significant. What kind of speech am I endorsing, participating in, collaborating with, and what kinds aren't I? And what it means to say that she's a defender of a culture of free speech isn't that she's open to everything being expressed on her platform, isn't that she's open to participating in forums where every kind of idea is trafficked in, but that she's vigorous in asserting her right to say what she wants to say in the face of people who want to kill her for it. And likewise, she's respecting that right in other people, and respecting also that, she has to do something to get her ideas out, and they have to do something to get their ideas out, and nobody's entitled to the platform she built to express her ideas, just like she's not entitled to their platforms.
I want to go back to the issue of cancellation that you mentioned earlier. So you say also in your essay that freedom of speech cannot be violated by any form of boycott and ostracism and cancellation, among other things. It can only be violated by the use of force.
Yes.
But what some people argue sometimes when it comes to cancellation is that the act of canceling someone is an act of force. So we were talking about how people, it's within their rights to be unjust and to say
Mhm.
things that may be despicable. It's part of their freedom of speech. But when that happens in the context of a cancellation, it often comes with a lot of aggression and the damaging of a person's reputation that might prevent them from, for instance, getting a job or even sustaining the job that they currently have, among other things. So, how can these sort of cancellations and public demonstrations through speech of disapproval of someone, can they ever turn into a violation of a person's rights?
Well, first, the that saying something unflattering about someone can, lead them to negative consequences for them. Other people don't want to deal with them and so forth. That is center of the page free speech. Now, there's an issue of defamation, and we could talk about whether defamation, which falls within the right to free speech, I think it doesn't. But let's assume, and we could talk about why it doesn't, but let's assume we're talking about cases that aren't defamation now. There's defamation law, and there are issues of the details of that. And you're a lawyer, and I'm not, so you may know more about this than I do. But if we putting aside defamation, right, which is not free speech. Um, if we're talking about an individual saying unflattering things about someone, that's within their right to free speech. Cancellation is just a whole bunch of people doing that together, right? So if I say, Augustina's awful and whatever, I haven't canceled you, but if thousands of people do it, maybe we have, and then nobody wants to deal with you. If the people have the right to do it one by one, they have the right to do it in a group. Now, they might be wrong to do it. And I think often people have been canceled and it's been unjust and wrong. But then often the things people say that they have a free speech to say are unjust and wrong. Now, can it edge into actual violations of rights? Yeah, if what's being advocated isn't just don't deal with this woman, but threaten her in some way. So, if, for example, I'm publishing your address in ways that encourage people to harass you, if I'm threatening you, and they're credible threats, and I'm encouraging other people to gang up and threaten you. There are things that edge into, and maybe not just edge, but go fully over the line into harassment, intimidation, threats, etc. But that's not, I take it, what cancellation means. What cancellation means is boycotting, which is sometimes just and sometimes unjust, but never a violation of free speech.
So, in this essay, you also say that freedom of speech is an absolute. But
Mhm.
a lot of people would oppose this view because they say that we do restrict a lot of speech, like the type of speech you just mentioned, kind of like harassing and threats and fraud and libel, incitement to violence, and that sort of thing. And
Mhm.
on the flip side, some people could argue that free speech is an absolute. So that means that they can say anything to whoever they want at any point, and at any place and under any circumstances is their freedom of speech.
Right.
So
It's free
can you
speech to
elaborate
go
on?
up to an infant and yell as loudly as possible in his ear, damaging his eardrum. And if you say no to that, then you're against free speech. Yeah. It's one to understand. Rights are about defining freedoms of actions in a social context. The context for the idea of rights is here we are human beings living in the same space, interacting with one another. And we're on the premise that we ought to each be able to lead our own lives by our own judgment for our own sakes and interact with one another only consensually and not by forcing ourselves into it. That's the kind of context for the idea of rights. And then what a right is defines the scope of action that is my leading my own life by my own judgment for my own sake. Um, where does that end, and where do some of my actions end up being interferences with you leading your own life? Right? That's what a right does. It defines that sphere. And so if you have that view of rights, it's important that rights not be balancing tests, that they be absolutes. You define a sphere, you mark out what is the sphere of action in which um, I can act unilaterally without anyone's permission. And what is the sphere in which I can't, because what I would be doing by acting in that way is moving into your sphere and making you unable to act unilaterally, or someone else's, right? So the point isn't that reality comes pre-divided where it's easy to see where these lines are. We have to do the work to figure out where they are, and that work is the work of defining and then implementing and protecting rights. And there's a certain amount of it that can be done very abstractly by philosophers, but then other parts of it have to be done in terms of coming up with specific laws that uh, uh, delimit the kind of details of rights. And it's actually the job of well, first philosophers, then philosophers of law, and then at the kind of margin, legislators. So how does this apply to the issue of rights? Well, you have to think about like what is actually being done in situations of defamation or situations of incitement. What is the principle we're trying to get at with the idea that there's freedom of speech, and how does it relate here? And the principle is that we're distinguishing communication of ideas from action, and from actions taken on people. So if I communicate an idea, and if I, you know, take you and like write the idea on your forehead or something, that's forcing myself on you. That's using you. It's not just communicating an idea. But what's wrong with like grabbing you and marking something on your forehead isn't that there's some content I'm expressing by whatever I mark it onto your forehead. It's that I grabbed you and did something to your body against your will, right? If I said the same thing that I marked on your forehead by writing it on a blackboard that I purchased and put on my front lawn, that would be fine, right? So we want to think about just the fact that I'm speaking or expressing myself in committing an action doesn't make the action rightful and doesn't make it an issue of free speech. I'm not free to do it, not because of the speech involved, but because it involves making use of someone else's body or resources against their consent. What the principle of free speech tells us is that the content of the speech as such can never be what makes an action unrightful and therefore illegal. That is outside of your rights and not legal. Now, the kinds of cases where it might seem to be borderline or dubious or something are cases where what I'm doing in the action is like a threat or harassment or intimidation or or conspiracy or something like that. But in incitement, but in those kinds of cases, what I'm doing is not expressing an idea for other people's consideration, but participating in an act of planning with other people. I'm conspiring with other people, right? That's what's going on in effect in incitement to violence. It's what's going on in so in incitement to violence. In threat, what I'm doing is I'm not communicating with you an idea, which I'm then leaving you free to take or leave, but rather I'm communicating to you my intention to use force on you. And in doing that, I'm trying to compel you to do something under threat of force. So that's, again, the action is not merely an action of communication. And what's wrong about it isn't that it's an action of communication. It's an attempt to force you, and then using communication in the context of doing that. And that's why, again, it's not part of the freedom of speech. In cases of defamation, these are a little bit more complicated, but I think there's a property right involved. So I think there's a kind of type of property someone has in their reputation, and defamation is a violation of that right. It's sort of akin to a trademark infringement. So if I pass myself off as you to sell pieces to a newspaper, I've seen that you've got some pieces appearing in newspapers, and you're getting a good reputation as a newspaper writer. So I pretend to be you and sell stuff to newspapers as though I was you. I am defrauding the newspapers who think they're getting your content, but in fact they're getting something from me. But I'm also stealing business from you, and I'm stealing the business. I'm not just taking business you might have gotten, but I'm rather trading as though I was you, and therefore taking your customers in that literal kind of thieving sense. So it's a kind of fraud, and it's a kind of violation of your property in your name as a name to trade under. If instead of doing that, what I say is all of Augustina's, I put it out into the world that all of your newspaper columns are plagiarized, and anyone who publishes them is liable to get sued and such and so forth, where all of that is false, and I have a reckless disregard for the truth in saying it and so forth. What I'm doing is, rather than stealing your business, I'm kind of doing the equivalent of taking a sledgehammer to it. I'm destroying a piece of property in your name and reputation that you've created, which you have a kind of trade right to, the same trade right I would be violating if I tried to do business under your name. And I think that's, in effect, how defamation works. So I view it as a type of property right violation.
That's interesting. I think part of the misunderstanding generally comes from seeing force only as something that is physically happening and not the sort of other aspects of it. But I want to move on to one
Well,
of
it is always physical in some sense. It always reduces back to the physical. It's not metaphorical. You're making money trading with somebody, and that money is physical, and newsprint is physical, and so forth. But this is all happening in the context of a situation of agreements, right? And the agreements over how to interact are what makes it voluntary versus involuntary versus forcing it upon somebody. And where there's deception involved, um, the deception can kind of pervert or distort what the agreements are. So in the case of fraud, I tell you I'm selling you one thing and you pay me money for it and I hand you the thing, but the box contains something different, right? We haven't had the voluntary exchange it may seem like we had. You've
Mhm.
given me money for X, but in fact, I've given you Y. And I think that is a kind of physical exchange that happened. It's just not the physical exchange you consented to. And so the exchange that happened is one that I kind of forced on you, because what makes it non-forcible is the consent to the exchange that's happening. And
That
that
makes
consent
sense.
wasn't there because of the deception.
Mhm. So in this essay, you take a position that may be seen as very, very radical and controversial by people that may not be familiar with the objectivist perspective. You argue that public education violates freedom of speech because it establishes certain opinions and forces taxpayers to fund education based on views and curricula that is imposed by the government, which they may or may not disagree with, and also naturally forces a lot of parents to send their children to learn in these schools, especially parents who may not be able to send their kids to pursue a private education.
Hmm.
So nobody has a choice about this because public education is funded through taxes.
Yes.
And you argue that in this case of public education, and I quote from your essay, the only position consistent with the right to free speech is abolitionism. The entire public education system should be abolished. So, can you elaborate a little bit and say why that is and what could potentially replace the system?
Well, let me say a little bit about why I make the point at all first. And I should say that I teach at a public university, have taught at other public universities. And my point isn't that one should have nothing to do with public universities so far as that, so long as they exist. And I talk about that in the piece. Um, we live in a world where a lot of education is collectivized by force through the government. And we need to learn how to navigate that world while we're fighting to change it. But the reason why I think it's important to recognize that the whole system is unjust and is a violation of freedom of speech is because once you recognize that, you recognize that there's not a right way to do it. There's not some right set of curricula for the public schools to have. And if they have some other set of curricula, it violates free speech, or some right way for them to determine what the curricula is, or what professors should get hired, or what the professors should be allowed to say in their jobs and so forth. And then we can defend that right way of doing it on the grounds of free speech and attack the other ones on the grounds that they're violations of free speech. There isn't a right way to do it. And so there's no way that's consistent with free speech. And I think that matters for understanding all the kinds of controversies that come up with education. The problem here is that we're forced to do together things that we should be free to do separately. We should be free to pursue education as teachers, as parents, as students, free of one another, coming together in the groups that we want to around the ideas and methods of education that we want to. But in fact, we are made to make decisions collectively. And it's that being made to be in a collective with someone, being made to be dealing with someone in ways and on terms that are against your judgment of what's best, right? That is, in effect, always what the violation of a right amounts to. And there's not, I think, a way to do it right. And I think it's important that there's not a way to do it right in understanding how to move forward. The goal has to be to get out of this kind of a system. And while we're in this kind of a system, to navigate it in a way that does the least damage and allows for the closest approximation to the kind of thing that we would have under freedom. And there's a lot of difficult kind of detailed arguments about like, well, what is the best way to do that and how does it work? But I think that framing is important for understanding how to do it. Otherwise, you end up thinking if the public school library takes this book out because some parents are opposed to it, then the public school library is violating free speech. And somebody else says, no, the public school, like it's violating free speech if it has the book, and it's violating it if it doesn't have the book.
Right.
Either way, and you get these, you look at these school board meetings where you have these distraught parents like yelling and arguing about each other about some book about, I don't know, certain sex acts or whatever that some people are horrified that their children might get to see and other people are horrified that they might be taken away from their children, and it's book banning. And the problem here, there are questions about what books are good for people, but the problem and the reason why people are at one another's throats is they're being forced to make this kind of decision collectively rather than being able to judge for themselves. And so you have to understand that that's where the essence of the problem is. And then you can think about how can we move towards solving it. And what we want to do in moving towards solving it is creating more and more avenues where people can be freer of one another. And what that looks like in higher education versus lower education, is different. What would the alternative be? I mean, the alternative would be a free, in the sense of politically free education system where people pay for their own educations or their children's, contracting with people who they think are good at educating them, like we do in other fields. You buy your own food and you deal with whatever store and providers and restaurants you want to. And we don't have to all make a decision together about what restaurants to go to and what foods they can offer. We each can do it on our own, by our own judgment, for our own sake, cooperating with
And
people where we accept best.
what would you say? Because I've been reading the last few months about at least a couple of states that want to incorporate a display of the Ten Commandments in every classroom. I think Louisiana is one of them. I believe there's one more state that is trying to do something like this. So this is from what I understand, what I think is a violation of the First Amendment. But this is a
Yeah,
consequence. No, go ahead. Yes. What do you have to say about that?
I think it's a violation, particularly of the Establishment Clause with religion in the
Hmm.
First Amendment. It depends on, again, there shouldn't be public schools. And part of the reason why there shouldn't be public schools is because you can't really separate out moral education from the rest of education. And some people think that moral education requires you doing it wrong if you don't have the Ten Commandments prominently displayed. Those people are mistaken. I don't think the Ten Commandments are morally good in the first place, and indoctrinating people with them is a real harm you're doing to people. But that's what some people think. Other people think it's various stuff from the Quran you need to know, and other people think it's other things, right? But the premise of American public education in a country where we're not supposed to have establishment of religion is that you can somehow separate out and wholly separate indoctrination and values from the rest of education. I don't think that's really possible, but that's a premise behind our public education system, and it's a problem in the public education system. And then when you try to bring values back in, how do you do it? Well, you can't, because there's going to be such conflict over the values. Now, I think the fact that we have a establishment clause in the Constitution means that there's an extra, in particular in American legal, the legal landscape, there's properly an extra hackles that go up about incorporating particular religious doctrines in education, and those kind of things should be fought back. But they should be fought not on the grounds of there's a good way to do public secular education for everybody that's somehow value neutral, and that's being imposed upon by having these Ten Commandments. Rather, there's not a good way to do it. But if we're going to be chained together and made to be educated together, people who disagree with one another, that evil is compounded by shoving the Ten Commandments down people's throats. At least with arithmetic, there's not going to be the kind of intense disagreement with it. Although, in fact, if you actually think about what's involved in teaching arithmetic and teaching it well, you'll find that there is a lot of disagreement. But and so we should roll back having arithmetic taught to us by force in a collectivized manner. But let's not compound the evil that exists with that now by adding the Ten Commandments to it.
I want to move on to another topic that you bring up in the essay, which is the threat of Islamic totalitarianism to free speech. And well, we all know about the attacks and the terrorist attacks that have happened because of freedom of speech. And you talk about how politicians and governments have failed to protect citizens from it. You argue that this failure is in part stems in part from their skepticism about that, these cartoons of the prophet and the pictures and depictions of him being valuable speech. And from what I gather, the attitude is something like, well, it's not okay to mock religion, it's not nice, you should not mock religion and they won't attack you, just stop doing that. So what do you think this sort of speech that is considered blasphemy by Islamists, why do you think it's worth defending?
Well, there are a few different points here. I mean, so one, I talk about Islamist and Islamist terrorism in the piece in the same way that I talk about the racist terrorism against Wells and others. These are kind of two running examples of things that
Yeah.
are real violations of free speech. And the common thread in these examples and why I use them in a piece that's talking about what a culture of free speech is, as well as what the right to free speech is because these are kinds of violations of the right to free speech that aren't committed by governments. So, particularly in an American constitutional context, we think about the First Amendment. When we think of violations of the right to free speech, we think about the government arresting someone for what they said. Um, but people, I think, rightly point out that there are violations of free speech that are not that, they're done by private parties. And examples of that would be this racist mob threatening the life of Ida Wells and destroying her newspaper, or the Islamist terrorists who beheaded an English teacher for displaying cartoons of Muhammad, who attacked Danish embassies, who attacked Salman Rushdie, and so forth. Now, in that case, there was a specific government official who issued a fatwa, but some of the particular people doing it were private actors. Right? So, in these cases, we have terrorist gangs operating without a government or not obviously at the behest of a government, attacking someone's free speech and attacking it violently. The problem isn't that they won't. That it's the problem is not that they're boycotting blasphemers; it's that they're killing blasphemers. The
Yeah.
point, the problem wasn't that people who didn't agree with Ida Wells were boycotting her; it's that they threatened to kill her and they burned down or they destroyed her newspaper. Right. So these are physical force exercised to terrorize people into silence, and this is a violation of freedom of speech. And part of government's job in all of these cases is to protect freedom of speech, which means to protect the people who have these rights, not from people who disapprove of or boycott or cancel them, but from people who would kill, rob, maim, and otherwise, physically attack them for expressing their views to try to terrorize them into silence. Um, Now, in that context, it doesn't matter whether the blasphemous ideas are of any value or not. If people are killing people over it, it's important to defend their right to speak, because we have a right to speak. And if people are not allowed to speak if they defend Muslims and they're terrorized into silence, well, what's next? That'll kind of mission creep and destroy everybody else. So even if it turned out that the things they were saying about Muslims were stupid and bad, and there was nothing about Islam or whatever that warranted criticism, and some of the speech you get that people are offended probably like that, um, it's important to defend the right because it's a right and because it's part of our freedom to voice our minds, and we're not going to be able to discover and understand what's true if we can't do that. And so, to take a case where there's a kind of speech that is the freedom to have this speech is violated, in this case, not by Islamists, but by many governments. Holocaust denial is illegal in a lot of countries.
Mhm.
I don't think there's any value to Holocaust denial. It's not like that speech is, it's not like they've got a point. They don't have a point, and it's a stupid thing to say. And you should, in a lot of cases, boycott or cancel people who say it. But if somebody's trying to kill them for saying it, we've got to, have their back against the people who are trying to kill them, and we should have their backs against the government who are trying to imprison them for it. And there should be, ACLUs and people defending them, and all of us should speak out against hate speech laws and against, in particular, these kind of laws against Holocaust denial. Right? But in the case of blasphemy laws and laws against making fun of religion, um, there I do think the speech has a lot of value. There's a lot wrong with religion, all of the religions. Indeed, religions are a lot of a source of the kind of thinking that is anti-freedom and anti-rights generally. And it's, I think, important to stand up for ideas if they're being dismissed or mocked, um, or dismissed as trivial, even if they're not targets of violence. So if somebody is, suppose we put an end to Islamism as a violent menace, and nobody was being killed for drawing pictures of Muhammad, but a lot of people were being boycotted and canceled for drawing pictures of Muhammad. Then I think a lot of us should stand up and stand with the people who are drawing the pictures of Muhammad and say this is a fine thing to draw. Nobody's violating their free speech anymore. They're just boycotting them and firing them and not wanting to deal with them. But it's unjust to boycott and fire and not want to deal with people who are drawing pictures of Muhammad, because drawing pictures of Muhammad is a reasonable thing to do. And I want to stand with those people, and I want to hire some of the people who got fired for doing it and so forth. So that would be the way to deal with it if you think the speech has value and people are being unjustly unjustly maligned and disassociated with for the speech. But as things stand, they're being killed, terrorized for their lives, and there I think it's important for not just individuals to step up, but for governments to step up and defend them. And in this case, in the case of Islamism, it's largely, not wholly, but largely a foreign policy issue, because the people who are committing this kind of terrorism are supported by foreign governments, and we've had a kind of pusillanimous policy towards them. And for that, ARI has a book on several books on failing to confront Islamic terrorism and on defending the right to free speech that talk about the foreign policy failures here and what the right approach would have been.
And related to this issue, I want to ask you about something that I encounter very often, uh, which is kind of like this concern about the line between thought, speech, and action. This comes up a lot in the context of ideological screen of immigrants, particularly
Mhm.
of Muslim immigrants. I mean, many other immigrants, but especially the Muslim immigrants, because a lot of people claim that Muslims shouldn't be welcome in America. We shouldn't allow Muslim immigration here because the Islamic religion is fundamentally opposed to American values. And the claim is that Islam is a religion that calls for action, and that action that this religion calls for violates the rights of others,
Mhm.
because they say it encourages things like female genital mutilation or oppressing women, beating up women, and other things like uh, trying to destroy infidels and carrying out terrorist attacks to do that and that sort of thing. So they claim that the spread of Islam itself via speech is something that will be detrimental for the rights of everyone and for American values, because it is spreading this violent. It incites people to take these actions that are violate rights. So there is kind of like this blurry line between the thought, the speech, and the action that people take based on this religion. So, what do you make of this argument, and what do you think? Is this any standard related to someone's religion or speech that could be legit, that could make it so it's legitimate for government to stop certain people from coming here based on their religion or ideology?
Well, let's think of it wider than people coming here, because there are people who are already here, right? And if somebody is, in fact, they're already here and they're here perfectly legally, but they're engaging in something that is jeopardizing and violating the rights of other people, then they should be arrested or expelled or something. We don't have to wait till we find someone like him crossing the border and then take a special stand against him. It's what we do to somebody who's already here like this, and then we could extrapolate to how we think about it in border cases. But the kinds of arguments that are being made here against Islam, if they're being made against Islam as such, apply equally well to all religion. No religion understood and interpreted rightly, um, as I think is the right way to interpret them, that is compatible with freedom of speech or any other freedom or the United States. And even if I'm wrong and there are some ways to interpret Christianity or Judaism or such and such where they are so compatible, as a lot of Christians and Jews think there is, still the majority of ways in which these religions have been interpreted throughout their history has clearly been incompatible with America and with freedom of speech. John Calvin certainly was no defender of freedom of speech, and neither was, St. Augustine or any of the kind of classic people. If, the Jews and Christians of the past couple of hundred years have been a lot better, that's to their credit, but there's still reason to worry about the religion generally. And what's actually happened is the Jews and Christians of the past few hundred years are just less serious about their religion. But the point is, the point applies to religion generally, not just to Islam. And it applies to religion arguably in the kind of essence of what the religion preaches, and certainly in how many of the adherents to the religions understood them. These were anti-freedom ideologies. And of course, it applies to lots of ideologies that aren't religious in obvious ways. It applies to them, I mean, communism, fascism, and yet these are paradigm things that people have a right to express their thoughts about. Is communism true? Is Karl Marx right about this or that? Is Schmidt, a fascist intellectual, right about this or that thing? These are kind of paradigm things that are within the realm of freedom of expression. So if it's okay to do it with that, then it's okay to do it with the Quran and the Bible and the Hindu Vedas or whatever text it's going to be. What we have to recognize is that when we're dealing with abstract ideas like this, there are a lot of steps between the thought and the action. And we have to think about where in this process and all ideas are for the sake of action and are about acting. Ideas aren't some realm detached from life in the sky that are irrelevant to how we act. Ideas matter because they're how we live and they drive us in our living. And so to say if an idea can have results in action that are bad and that are rights violating, then that idea can't be shared, is ultimately to say no ideas can be shared but the true ones. And that's to do away with freedom of speech entirely. So what you have to do if you don't want to do away with freedom of speech entirely, which means if you don't want to do with freedom at all entirely, you have to distinguish between thought and action in a context where you understand that all thought is ultimately for the sake of action. All thought has implications for action. Nonetheless, the context by which we deliberate as individuals and by which we deliberate and conspire in groups to act is complicated and has many kind of steps and phases. And there's a difference between you and I having a reading discussion group where we're discussing the Communist Manifesto and maybe we're giving it a more sympathetic hearing than it warrants or whatever it is. There's a difference between that and us plotting to sell nuclear secrets to the Soviets, between us blowing things up. Likewise, there's a difference between us reading some passages in the Quran or in the Bible and from us deciding that what we should do because we believe in those passages is work to overthrow the government or kill these people who we regard as infidels. And I don't think we have that much trouble drawing that distinction in most cases, other than to do with Islam. And I don't think it's that hard to do with Islam. The fact remains that there is a particular movement of people. There's a particular movement within Islam, which is Islamism, which is about combining Islam with the state. Maybe that's really the right interpretation of Islam all along. Maybe it's not, but whether it is or not, it's a particular strand within Islam. Not all Muslims are Islamists, right? Just like not all Christians are Methodists or whatever. It's a particular, or not all Catholics are integralists, which I think integralism in Catholicism is the equivalent of Islamism in Islam, right? But then among Islamists, not all of them are, so Islamism would be something like being a Nazi, or being a communist, being someone who believes in this totalitarian ideology, or being a Catholic integralist, I think is a variant of that as well. So you're someone like that. And then that's an idea that you have the freedom to spread and express, just like you have the freedom to spread and express communism. But then among people who hold that idea, which again is not all Muslims, there are people who don't just believe it and think, well, through my vote and through various peaceable means, I want to persuade people to move gradually in this direction. But rather what I want to do is try to overthrow the government. I want to engage in violent jihad and terrorism. And there's a sizable number of people who want to do that. It's a very small minority of Muslims. And even, it's not even all Islamists. But those people are involved with certain organizations that are actively plotting to do those things, just like the communists who are members of the Communist Party who were taking orders from Russia and so forth were not everybody who thought Marx was good. And those people need to be addressed by the government. And there is a kind of slippery slope down to those people from people who are not actively involved in violating anybody's rights, as the people who are conspiring to commit terrorist acts are. But there are people who make it easier for such people to exist by giving some kind of sanction or moral support or tacit approval to their ideas. And some of them are like, they wouldn't commit terrorism themselves, but they're apologists for it. And then there are people who are apologists for the people who are apologists and so forth, down to the guy who goes to the mosque or the church every Sunday, Friday or Sunday or Saturday, all of which people, I think, have some degree of complicity morally in the actions. And it's that kind of degree of complicity that when you go to church, when you go to an ARI lecture or contribute to it, when you're supporting ideas that have implications in how people act, including implications that could ultimately lead to defending or violating rights. And that's why it's important to be scrupulous and to care about who you interact with and support in which ways. And why you might want to boycott some people and cancel some people. But there is nevertheless a difference between morally condoning, sanctioning, and otherwise unjustly supporting bad ideas, and participating in, conspiring in, perpetrating violent, rights-violating actions based upon them. And that's a line that we're able to draw in law. I think we have drawn well in law. And that's how you should think about it with respect to government actions against people. And so that's how to deal with it, abstracted from the case of immigrants. Take someone who's going to a mosque. Now, there are extra set of considerations about how do we think about immigration and what are that brings us to broader issues. But I think it's basically the same issues apply there.
So, Greg, one of the last things I want to ask you is this issue of protest, which has been on the conversation lately for many people, given the campus protests that we've seen this year and since last year with the support of Hamas that many students are offering. You point out in the essay that there are protests that can be improper when they violate the rights of others by like disturbing the public thoroughfare and other ways of protesting. And you agree with Ayn Rand that the 1964 Berkeley campus protests are an example of this, and that this type of massive civil disobedience cannot be allowed in a civilized society. And you quote from Rand, and I would like to read this quote from the essay where she talks about this protest. She says, quote, "Mass disobedience is an assault on the concept of rights. It is a mob's defiance of legality as such." And she
Mhm.
continues, "The only power of a mob as against an individual is greater muscular strength, i.e., plain, brute physical force. The attempt to solve social problems by means of physical force is what a civilized society is established to prevent." So I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit on this concept of civil disobedience, and is there any instance in which civil disobedience is permissible? And I'm thinking specifically of instances of um, massive protests against unjust laws or events or even governments that are oppressive.
Yeah, well, I think we want to separate out a few of these cases. If you're fighting against a government that's oppressive, you think the government is illegitimate in the first place, you're fomenting a revolution. There are cases in which it's right to foment a revolution, but then it's not an issue of free speech. What you're trying to do is
Mhm.
engage in violent insurrection against the government. And there are times when that's the thing to do because the government is so awful and unjust and it needs to be replaced. But then it's not, if somebody raises arms against their government and they're marching, if the British shot George Washington while he was, leading an army against them, the thing to say isn't that they violated his free speech; it's that they killed him while he was fighting a revolution against them, and he was in the right. But what he was doing isn't speaking; it was firing musket balls at them, and they fired back. So I don't think it's an issue of free speech; it's an issue of you're now at war, and you're at war
Mhm.
defending freedom or fighting against freedom. And there are cases where people should be at war or in preludes to war. I think any kind of protest against Iran or North Korea or governments like that are entirely justified. And there are cases where um, there's a kind of more limited insurrection against uh, something unjust that's happening in a society, and they're breaching legality, but for this kind of purpose. And I don't think in some cases that's right, in other cases it's wrong, but it's not. The issue isn't about free speech. It's Now when we're talking about protests, um, much of what passes for protests these days isn't anything to do with speech. It's allegedly about getting a certain idea out, but it's actually not. It's about disrupting a campus, shutting down the campus, occupying a space, stopping people from going about their days. And particularly when we're dealing with private property being used in these ways as a as in opposition to the ways that the owners want to do it, it's got nothing to do with speech. It's just these people forcing themselves on the owners of the property. That was true of the Occupy Wall Street protests, for example. Now, where the property is public property, university campuses that are state owned, which shouldn't be but are, or public thoroughfares or whatever. Here again, we have a situation where there's not a right way to administer a public university or a public campus or a public road. The thing shouldn't be the industry that this thing represents, education, transit, etc., shouldn't be collectivized, and people should have the rights to get into whatever agreements they want to voluntarily around these things, and then determine terms of usage for them. But okay, they have been collectivized, and a policy has been made by which it's determined how are these collective properties going to be used for what purposes. There are laws about and regulations about and university policies about what the quad could be used in what way for at what time and so forth. And in a context where that's what we have, again, it shouldn't be determined that way, but it is. Um, part of respecting rights and respecting people's ability to live their lives for their own sake by their own judgment, to the extent that that's possible in a society that has these things collectivized to the extent that it does, is that those laws be respected and enforced in a way that's free, or as free as possible, of bias towards one ideology or another. And so, and that means that they're, enforced in as objective and as fair a manner as is capable with these laws. And if what we have happen is certain groups are allowed to, in effect, take over campuses and prevent them from being used for people studying in a way that they've paid to study and they understood and planned their lives around, they're allowed to study this way. But these groups are allowed to occupy the campuses, to shout down people, to make excessive noise, to stop, and in general, to use them outside of the terms that it's generally understood that they should be used on. Exceptions are being made for them, and they're being favored in this way. Then that is a exacerbation of the violation of rights that's involved in having this public property to begin with. And again, if it's private property, as Columbia's campus is, for example, in New York, then it's simply an issue of trespass and violation of the rights of everybody who owns or has a stake in the university.
So, Greg, last question: what is a true, like, rational culture of free speech that we can promote in our society? What are some positive examples of that?
It's a culture where people value and jealously guard their ability to live their own lives by their own judgment, for their own sake, and to communicate ideas as a part of that, and who recognize that the communication of ideas as such is never a violation of anybody's rights, but who also recognize that communicating ideas requires resources, requires collaboration from other people, and that the other people have the right to choose to be involved in that exchange or not. And that's an expression of their freedom of speech. And we have examples of lots of associations now, voluntary associations that people are taking responsibility for around the issue of speech. This is basically what the internet is. And all the social media services and all the platforms, they all have things that by my lights are false. And some of them talk in 2 million a way sometimes, and some of them talk into um, uh, collectivistic a way about what things they're going to deny on their platform sometimes. But the big picture here is we have lots of people all over the world thinking about how to work together to attract audiences, advertisers, speakers, what kinds of arrangements are most mutually beneficial to create this tremendous kind of communication infrastructure for the spread of ideas that we've never seen before. And more people are able to speak now to more people, with more people supporting them through ads and whatever, than at any point before in human history. It's a tremendous achievement. And it's important that all of us recognize this and recognize what's good about it and the kind of terms in which to properly defend it, because it's under attack from all directions, from people who imagine themselves to be defenders of free speech and from people who don't. So we want to really recognize that what's good here is this network of voluntary relationships over the exchange of ideas where everybody's taking responsibility for their role in it. And in the piece, I give a lot of examples of particular individuals who I think have done an excellent job with this, particular individuals in the communication space. I think Substack's business model is really inspiring here. Sometimes they defend and articulate it in 2 million terms. So if you think about what the company's actually doing, I think likewise YouTube. I think Musk, in how he defends and thinks about what he's doing with Twitter, is a million mess. But the existence of networks like Twitter and Facebook and so forth, they're doing something right, that they're able to attract and maintain so many people on them and facilitate so much communication. In the realm of business and policies regarding what kind of speech to allow and promote at work, I think Brian Armstrong of Coinbase rather, is a real hero here. And if you read the letter that he published called the Coinbase Memo that inspired something called Mission Protocol, I think it's a real model of how to comport oneself in business over these issues, particularly that the policies he adopts, which I think are wise and good policies, he doesn't say everybody should adopt them. He says, we're Coinbase, this is our mission, these are the policies we're adopting, and now that you know, you work with us or go elsewhere, right? He's taking responsibility for he's trying to make a certain kind of community. He has certain policies that he thinks are going to promote that, and you should join him or not, depending on whether you agree. And that's the way that we should be thinking about speech. I have things to say. I have work I want to do. I'm willing to associate with people on these terms and not those terms. Here's where I stand. Do you want to work with me? And that's what a culture of free speech looks like.
Greg, as usual, you've shared so much great insight with us. So thank you so much. And where can people find you if they want to learn more about you and your other work?
Well, I have a Twitter account. I'm trying to tweet a bit more regularly. That's at G Salmieri, or an X account now, I guess they're called. And I think that's probably the place to follow. If I have anything I want to promote, I'll tweet about it there.
To our audience, if you have found this conversation insightful, you can go read Dr. Salmieri's paper on our website, New Idea Live. The link on the screen will take you there, or you can look it up on our website. And if you like the essay, which I'm pretty sure you will, you can buy the book that has many other essays. Dr. Salmieri collaborates in other essays in this work, and there's also essays by other objectivist intellectuals. As usual, if you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have questions or comments about today's episode, or if you have suggestions for future episodes, please send us an email at newideal@aynrand.org. Greg, thank you so much for this conversation today, and thanks to our audience for tuning in. See you next time.